Emma, I need you to represent Madison in her bankruptcy case. My mother's voice came through the phone with that particular tone of expectation she'd always used when asking me to clean up my sister's messes, as though my compliance was simply a foregone conclusion, a formality we had to get through before moving on to the logistics. I was sitting in my corner office on the 42nd floor of Morrison and Keller in downtown Chicago, looking out at Lake Michigan while rain streaked down the glass. And for a moment, I couldn't find words because the sheer audacity of this request had literally stolen my breath. "No," I said finally, and the single syllable felt like jumping off a cliff. There was a pause, the kind of silence that used to make me rush to fill it with apologies or explanations, but I'd learned something in the 10 years since I'd left home at 18, with nothing but a denied dream and a mountain of student loan debt. I'd learned that I didn't owe anyone an explanation for protecting myself. "What do you mean, no?" my mother asked, and I could hear the confusion in her voice because in her mind, I was still the younger daughter who absorbed disappointment without complaint, who worked 3 jobs and took night classes without asking for help, who watched her $75,000 college fund disappear into my sister's fantasy business without making a scene at family dinners. "I mean, I won't be representing Madison," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. The same tone I used when explaining to clients that their financial situation was beyond salvaging. "I can give you some referrals to excellent bankruptcy attorneys in the area." The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd become a specialist in bankruptcy law, that I spent my days walking people through the consequences of financial mismanagement and poor decisions, that I'd built a successful career at one of Chicago's most prestigious firms, essentially cleaning up messes, not unlike the one my sister had made of her life. I'd made senior associate 2 years ahead of schedule. I had a reputation for being thorough, practical, and unsentimental about financial realities. Partners brought me their most complex cases because I could see through the emotional noise to the hard facts underneath. And the hardest fact I'd ever had to face was that my family had always seen me as a resource to be used rather than a person to be valued, and that no amount of achievement would ever change how they saw me unless I changed how I saw myself. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. I remembered the moment my future collapsed with perfect clarity, because it happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in March, when I was 18 years old, sitting at our kitchen table with both parents while spring sunlight came through the window and made patterns on the worn laminate surface. I'd brought my Northwestern University acceptance letter, the financial aid package, and a notebook where I'd carefully calculated exactly what I'd need from the college fund my parents had been contributing to since I was born, the fund they'd talked about at every birthday and good report card, the fund that represented my ticket to the future I'd been working toward my entire academic life. "So with the partial scholarship and my financial aid, I'll need about $50,000 from the college fund," I'd said, showing them my calculations, feeling proud of the scholarship I'd earned, feeling grateful for the fund they'd built. My mother looked at my father, and something passed between them that made my stomach drop even before she spoke. "Emma, honey, there's something we need to tell you about the college fund," she said, and her tone was too casual, too light for what came next. "We gave it to Madison for her business." I remembered staring at her, waiting for the clarification or the joke or the explanation that would make this make sense, but my father just looked down at his hands, and my mother continued talking as though she'd just told me they'd switched cable providers. "It's $75,000, Emma. Madison needed it for her luxury lifestyle coaching business, and it's a real opportunity for her to build something meaningful. You understand, don't you? You're so smart and capable, you can just get student loans like everyone else, but Madison needs this chance to find herself and build a career." Madison walked into the kitchen then, probably drawn by the sound of the conversation, and she was wearing expensive new clothes I hadn't seen before, carrying a designer bag that must have cost a month of my part-time job earnings. "You can just get loans, Em," Madison said, leaning against the counter with complete confidence in her right to my future. I have a real opportunity here. Mom and Dad are investing in something that could actually turn into a career, not just another generic college degree. I remembered looking at my father, waiting for him to intervene or advocate or do something besides sit there in silence, while my sister dismissed my education as generic and my mother reframed theft as investment. But he just shifted in his chair and said nothing at all. The Northwestern packet sat on the table between us, the scholarship letter that represented hundreds of hours of studying and perfect grades and extracurricular activities and essay drafts, and I understood in that moment that none of it had mattered, because I'd been working toward a future that my parents had already signed over to my sister without asking me, without even warning me until the decision was completely final and irreversible. Madison's luxury lifestyle coaching business was apparently designed to help successful women elevate their personal brand and embody abundance, which, as far as I could tell from her glossy website, meant taking selfies in expensive clothes and posting inspirational quotes about manifesting prosperity. But the $75,000 that should have been my education went into making this fantasy look convincing to absolutely no one who mattered. She rented office space in a trendy part of town for $1,800 a month, hired a web designer to create a site that probably cost $10,000 with its professional photography and sleek interface, and invested in what she called her authority wardrobe, because apparently you couldn't coach people on luxury lifestyle while wearing anything from a normal store. I watched this happen from the cramped apartment I shared with two roommates near the community college where I'd enrolled instead of Northwestern, working the morning shift at a coffee shop starting at 5 a.m., attending classes from 9 to 3, and then working evenings at a campus library and weekends doing data entry remotely for a medical billing company. I was taking 18 credits per semester trying to compress my degree timeline because every semester cost money I didn't have. And every day I saw Madison's Instagram stories showing her office space tour and her investment pieces and her motivational posts about taking risks and betting on yourself, all funded by the bet my parents had made with my future. My mother called every Sunday and spent 45 minutes talking about Madison's business, how brave she was to be an entrepreneur, how proud they were that she was building something meaningful, how the clients were surely going to start pouring in any day now because Madison had such natural charisma and vision. "And how are your classes, Emma?" she'd ask in the last 5 minutes of the call. And before I could say more than fine, she'd be back to Madison's latest business strategy or networking event or social media breakthrough. I studied for exams on the bus between jobs, ate ramen and peanut butter sandwiches to save money, and watched my sister post about business lunches at expensive restaurants and networking events that looked identical to regular parties except everyone was dressed better and holding champagne. My father sent me $200 once with a note saying, "For books," and when I called to thank him, he said quietly, "I know this isn't what we planned, Emma." But he didn't say anything else, and he didn't send any more money because Madison's business kept needing more investment, more support, more of everything, while I learned that needing nothing was the only way to avoid disappointment. The exhaustion was total and comprehensive, living in my bones, and I fell asleep in library study rooms and showed up to my coffee shop shifts with my eyes burning, and the only thing that kept me moving forward was the stubborn certainty that I would prove everyone wrong by succeeding on my own terms, that I would build something real out of the rubble of my stolen dream, and that someday the contrast between Madison's performance and my actual achievement would be so stark that even my mother would have to see it. The college fund wasn't the beginning of the differential treatment, just the most expensive manifestation of a pattern that had been establishing itself since Madison and I were children, a pattern I'd tried to rationalize and excuse and understand until the weight of accumulated evidence made denial impossible. When Madison turned 16, our parents bought her a used Honda Civic for $3,000, presented with a cake and a party where she invited 20 friends, and she complained that it wasn't new and that the interior smelled weird. But she drove it to school every day while I rode the bus for another 2 years until I could save enough from my part-time job at the grocery store to buy my own car for $800 that broke down every few months. Madison's high school graduation party cost $5,000 according to the receipt I accidentally saw on my father's desk. Held at a rented venue with catering and a DJ and a photo booth, with relatives flying in from 3 states, and Madison wearing a white dress like it was a wedding. While my high school graduation 2 years later was acknowledged with a sheet cake from the grocery store bakery and dinner at an Olive Garden, where my mother spent most of the meal talking about how Madison was adjusting to college. I graduated as valedictorian with a 4.0 GPA and a full roster of AP credits and admission to Northwestern, and my mother put the announcement in the family newsletter with one sentence. But when Madison made Dean's List one semester with a 3.2 GPA, my mother called every relative personally to share the news and posted about it on Facebook with 3 paragraphs about Madison's dedication and intelligence. When I asked once, carefully, why Madison seemed to get more attention and resources and celebration, my mother looked at me with what seemed like genuine confusion and said, "Madison needs more support, Emma. She's sensitive and the world is harder for her. But you're so capable and self-sufficient that we don't have to worry about you the same way." And I understood that my competence had become the justification for my neglect, that being strong meant being overlooked, that needing nothing was the role I'd been assigned in this family system. Madison got help with college applications and essay editing and campus visits to 5 different schools, while I filled out my applications alone at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed. And when I asked my father to read my personal statement, he said he would but then never did. And I submitted it without feedback and got in anyway because I'd learned that achievement without support was still achievement. Every Christmas morning meant watching Madison open twice as many presents. Every parent-teacher conference meant hearing about Madison's potential while my perfect grades were met with nodding and, "That's what we expect from you." Every family dinner meant centering Madison's struggles and dreams and needs, while my own became background noise, and I developed a determination built on the understanding that if I wanted anything in life, I would have to create it entirely alone, that waiting for my parents' support or recognition or investment was waiting for something that would never come, and that the only person I could truly rely on was myself. 2 years after Madison took my college fund, the cracks in her luxury lifestyle coaching business had become chasms impossible to ignore even by my mother's determined optimism, and the Instagram posts had shifted from confident proclamations about client transformations to increasingly abstract quotes about persistence and pivoting and trusting the journey, which I recognized as the language of someone pretending everything was fine while drowning. I was in my second year at state school by then, still working 3 jobs, but maintaining my 4.0 GPA through what I can only describe as sheer stubborn will. And I'd stopped following Madison's social media because watching her perform success with my stolen future had become too painful. But my mother's Sunday calls kept me updated whether I wanted to be or not, with mentions of Madison restructuring her business model and focusing on her core offerings, which I understood meant she had no clients and no income. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March, while I was at the library between my afternoon classes and my evening shift, and I almost didn't answer because I was studying for a statistics exam and had exactly 40 minutes to review 3 chapters. But something made me pick up, and Madison's voice came through with that particular tone of casual entitlement that I'd learned to recognize as preceding a request. "Hey, so I'm calling because I have this amazing opportunity to expand the business, but I need a small amount of capital to really take it to the next level. And I was thinking, since you're working so much, you probably have some savings, and this could actually be a great investment for you, because once the business takes off, you'd see returns on whatever you loan me," she said in one breath like she'd rehearsed it. and I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized she was about to ask me for money, me who was living on 4 hours of sleep and dining hall food and hadn't bought new clothes in 8 months. How much? I asked, and she said, $10,000, maybe 12 to be safe, but I'd pay you back within 6 months once this new revenue stream kicks in. And I actually laughed out loud in the quiet library, which earned me looks from other students, because the audacity of asking me for $10,000 when she'd already taken $75,000 of my money was so enormous I couldn't process it as anything but absurd. Madison, I don't have $10,000. I'm a full-time student working 3 jobs to pay for community college because my college fund went to your business. I have maybe $800 in savings for emergencies, I said, as calmly as I could manage. And there was a pause before she said, well, you could get a loan or put it on a credit card. This is really important, Emma. This could be what finally makes the business profitable, and then I could pay back mom and dad too. And I understood that she'd already asked them for more money, and they'd either refused or run out. And now she'd moved on to extracting resources from me. I told her no. Just a flat, simple no, without explanation or justification. And she got Madison upset, which meant her voice went tight and wounded, and she said, I can't believe you won't help me, after everything our family has done for you, which was such a staggering reversal of reality that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at it. When I refused again and ended the call, she must have immediately called our mother, because 20 minutes later my phone rang, and it was Mom, asking why I was being so selfish and unsupportive when Madison was struggling, and family helps family, and didn't I understand that Madison's success would benefit all of us? And I said, how exactly would her success benefit me when I'm the one who lost my education fund so she could take selfies in expensive clothes? And my mother went quiet in that particular way that meant I'd said something true that she had no intention of acknowledging, before she told me I was being cruel and that my bitterness was unattractive and that she'd raised me better than this. The guilt came in waves after I hung up. The familiar, terrible feeling that maybe I was wrong, maybe I was selfish, maybe good people helped their family even when it hurt. But underneath the guilt was something newer and harder, a small voice that said I had the right to protect myself, and my resources, and my future. That saying no didn't make me a bad person. That boundaries weren't betrayal, even though my family treated them that way. It was the first time I'd ever explicitly refused to sacrifice myself for Madison's benefit, and the aftermath felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying, like I'd stepped out of a role I'd been playing my entire life, and now had no script for what came next. The acceptance letter from Northwestern Law School arrived on a Thursday in April, thick envelope with purple branding that I recognized immediately, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of the restaurant where I worked evening shifts and opened it with shaking hands, reading the words, "We are pleased to offer you admission," 3 times before I let myself believe it was real. The scholarship offer was partial, covering 40% of tuition, which meant I'd still need to take out substantial loans on top of the undergraduate debt I'd already accumulated, and when I did the math sitting there in my car with the calculator app I'd used to track every dollar for the past 3 years, the total came to $120,000 in educational debt by the time I graduated, a number so enormous it made my stomach clench with fear even as I felt the pull of possibility. I waited until Sunday dinner to tell my parents, thinking maybe this achievement would finally be the thing that made them proud, that maybe they'd see I'd fought my way to one of the best law schools in the country, despite everything, and recognize what that meant. And I practiced the announcement in my head, making it sound casual and confident, like it wasn't the culmination of every sacrifice I'd made for 3 years. My mother was setting the table when I told them, and she stopped with a serving spoon halfway to the bowl and said, "Law school? That's so unnecessary, Emma. It's 3 more years and all that debt when you could get a job now with your bachelor's degree. And honestly, Madison could really use some help with her business. Maybe you could work with her for a while and then decide about more school." And I felt something crack inside my chest at the realization that even Northwestern Law School, wasn't enough to shift their attention or pride or support in my direction. My father set down his glass and said with that reasonable tone he used when he was about to suggest something he'd already decided was best, "Maybe you should wait a year, Emma. Let things settle financially. Help us out a bit since you'll be graduating soon and Madison's business needs some capital to really get stable." And I understood they expected me to delay my future to fund my sister's continued failure, to put my dreams on hold indefinitely, while Madison's needs continued to consume every family resource. Madison looked up from her phone long enough to say, "I mean, law school is kind of overkill anyway. Everyone knows lawyers are miserable," before going back to scrolling, and the dismissiveness was so casual and complete that I felt the last thread of hope that they might celebrate with me simply dissolve. I told them I was accepting the admission and the scholarship, that I'd already calculated the loans and created a repayment plan, that I was doing this with or without their support, and my mother's face did that thing where it closed off completely and she said, "Well, I hope you know what you're doing, but don't come to us when you're drowning in debt and regret." And I looked at both my parents sitting there at the table and realized with absolute clarity that I would never get their support or encouragement or investment, that waiting for them to suddenly see my worth and choose me was waiting for something that would fundamentally never happen because the family system required me to be self-sufficient and Madison to be supported, and trying to change that dynamic was trying to change their entire understanding of how our family worked. I left dinner early that night and drove back to my apartment and called the law school the next morning to accept my place in the incoming class. And I felt terrified and alone, and also something like relief, because at least now I knew exactly where I stood and could stop hoping for something different, could stop waiting for my parents to show up for me, and just focus on showing up for myself. Madison's luxury lifestyle coaching business officially closed in November of my second year of law school, 3 years and 2 months after it had opened with such fanfare in my college fund. And I learned about it not from any family announcement, but from seeing her business Instagram account go dark, and then her personal post that said something about completing this chapter of my journey and evolving beyond the constraints of traditional business models, which I understood as the language of failure dressed up as intentional choice. My mother called me the following week while I was between classes and told me in this carefully controlled voice that Madison had made the difficult but mature decision to close the business because the market wasn't ready for her vision, because clients weren't willing to invest in themselves at the level necessary for real transformation, because the economy had made luxury services challenging, and I listened to her construct this narrative that absolved Madison of any responsibility or poor judgment, and I said, "How much money was lost total?" And there was a long pause before my mother said, "That's not really the point, Emma. The point is that Madison tried something brave and now she needs family support during this transition." But I asked again and finally she admitted that between the original $75,000 from my college fund and additional investments they'd made over the 3 years, the total loss was around $95,000, a number so staggering that I had to sit down on a bench outside the law building while my mother continued talking about how these things happen and how entrepreneurship is risky and how at least Madison had followed her dreams. There was no apology in that conversation, no acknowledgement that my college fund had been completely incinerated on a business that had never had a single verifiable client or dollar of legitimate revenue. No recognition that I was now carrying 6 figures of student loan debt because they'd given my educational future to Madison's expensive fantasy. And when I said, "So my Northwestern tuition paid for 3 years of Madison taking selfies and renting office space," my mother's voice went cold and she said, "You know, your bitterness about this is really unattractive, Emma. We all make sacrifices for family, and Madison is going through a very difficult time right now and needs compassion, not judgment from her little sister." And I felt something inside me shut down completely, some last door of hope that they might ever acknowledge what they'd done to me, simply closing and locking. Madison moved back into our parents' house the week after Thanksgiving with no job prospects and no plan beyond posting on social media about taking time to heal and reconnect with her authentic self. And my mother reported this to me like it was a positive development. Like Madison moving backwards into dependence at 31 was somehow a mature choice rather than the inevitable consequence of 3 years of play acting success with no actual business foundation. I was thriving in law school by then, despite the exhaustion that had become my permanent state, top 15% of my class and getting called on by professors who recognized I did the reading and understood the material. But when I mentioned making law review in that same phone call, my mother said, "That's nice, honey," in this distracted voice before returning to the topic of Madison's emotional journey and whether I thought it would be helpful for her to get a life coach. And I actually laughed, which confused my mother into silence, because the irony of Madison needing a life coach after failing as a life coach was apparently lost on everyone but me. The summer internship at Richardson and Cole came through in March of my second year. One of the most prestigious corporate law firms in Chicago, with a bankruptcy practice that represented Fortune 500 companies. And when I got the offer email, I sat in the law library and read it 5 times before I let myself feel the surge of accomplishment. Because this was the kind of placement that opened doors, the kind of opportunity that students with family money and connections usually secured, while people like me were supposed to be grateful for whatever we could get. The salary was $18,000 for 10 weeks, which meant I could actually quit my weekend job at the bookstore and my evening tutoring gigs and focus entirely on the internship. Could show up not exhausted for once and give it everything I had. And that summer became a turning point where I discovered I was genuinely good at this work. That understanding corporate financial structures and bankruptcy code came naturally to me in a way that felt almost ironic given that I'd spent years watching my family make every possible financial mistake, while I'd had to learn discipline and planning just to survive. My supervising partner was a woman named Catherine Liu, who had built the bankruptcy practice from nothing and who seemed to recognize something in me during our first meeting. And she gave me real work instead of just research assignments. Let me sit in on client meetings and draft actual motions and asked my opinion like it mattered. And for the first time since starting law school, I felt like someone with authority saw my potential and was actively invested in developing it. I made law review that spring based on my grades and a writing competition submission, which meant even more work added to an already crushing schedule, but also meant my resume now had the kind of credential that made employers pay attention. And I collected these achievements quietly, privately, like building an escape ladder one rung at a time, where each award and honor and opportunity was proof that I could make it entirely on my own. My mother called once that summer and talked for 20 minutes about Madison's job search struggles and how depressed she was living at home again, and how my parents were worried about her self-esteem. And when I mentioned that I'd made law review, there was a brief pause, and then, "That's nice, honey. I'm sure that will look good on your resume, but I'm really concerned about your sister right now. She's talking about maybe going back to school for something, but she's not sure what, and we're trying to be supportive, but it's hard when she's so discouraged." And I realized my mother had called not to check on me at all, but to see if maybe now that I had this prestigious internship, I might be willing to offer Madison some career guidance or connections, might be willing to share some of the resources I'd fought so hard to earn with the sister who had casually consumed my entire college fund and never once acknowledged what that had cost me. Thanksgiving that year was the last holiday I attended at my parents' house for a long time, sitting at the table while my mother served Madison first and asked her gentle questions about how she was feeling and what she needed while barely looking in my direction. And when my father asked about law school, in this perfunctory way, I mentioned the internship offer to return to Richardson and Cole the following summer, and my mother said, "Well, that's good. You're certainly building a career. Though I do worry you're missing out on other things." Madison was saying how she wishes you two were closer, but you're always so busy. And I felt the familiar ache of being made to feel selfish for succeeding, guilty for not sacrificing my opportunities to prop up my sister's ego. And I left early that night, claiming I had studying to do, and drove back to campus with this growing clarity that the distance between me and my family wasn't something to feel bad about, but something necessary for my survival. That their calls and holidays and expectations were all designed to pull me back into a role I'd never agreed to play, and continuing to show up was just volunteering for more of the same pain. I graduated from law school in May, top 10% of my class with honors, and a law review credential that had required sacrificing what remained of my social life. And 3 days after the ceremony, I received the formal offer from Richardson and Cole that I'd been expecting since my second summer there, but which still felt surreal when I saw it in writing. $190,000 starting salary as a first-year associate in their bankruptcy division, plus bonus potential that could add another 30,000, benefits that included health insurance I wouldn't have to worry about affording, and a signing bonus of $15,000 that hit my bank account like a small miracle. I sat alone in my apartment that evening, the offer letter on my kitchen table, and let myself feel the full weight of what I'd accomplished entirely on my own, with no family money or connections or support. How every single piece of this success had been built through years of exhaustion and sacrifice, and refusing to give up even when it would have been easier to be bitter and defeated. And I cried for maybe 20 minutes, not from sadness, but from this overwhelming sense of having actually made it. Having actually done the impossible thing I'd promised myself I would do when I was 18 years old, and watching my college fund disappear into Madison's fantasy. I didn't tell my family immediately because I wanted to keep this achievement to myself for a while, wanted to protect it from being diminished or turned into something about Madison, and I spent a week just existing in the private knowledge that I was about to start a career that would finally allow me to attack my student loans aggressively and build actual financial security, and never have to work 3 jobs again just to survive. When I finally called my mother on a Sunday afternoon and told her about the offer, there was a pause, and then she said, "Well, that's wonderful, Emma. I'm sure you'll do very well," in this tone that managed to be both congratulatory and somehow flat, lacking the enthusiasm she'd always had for Madison's ventures no matter how obviously doomed they were. And before I could even respond, she continued with, "I'm glad you called, actually. I wanted to talk to you about Madison. She's really struggling right now, and we're worried about her. She's been looking for work, but nothing is panning out, and she's getting really discouraged. And your father and I were thinking, maybe now that you're going to have this good salary, you might be able to help her with rent for a few months while she gets back on her feet, maybe 2 or 3 thousand a month just temporarily, until she finds something." And I felt something cold settle in my chest, because of course this was how my job offer would be received, not as my achievement, but as a potential resource for Madison, not as the result of my years of grinding work, but as an opportunity for me to finally do my duty as the supportive little sister. I said, "No, Mom, I'm not going to do that. I have 6 figures of student loan debt to pay off, and I need to focus on my own financial stability." And my mother's voice shifted into this disappointed tone as she said, "Emma, I understand you have loans, but Madison is family and she's in crisis right now. She's even talking about having to move back home permanently, which would be so damaging to her self-esteem, and you're going to be making so much money. Surely you can spare a little to help your sister who's always been there for you." And I actually laughed at that last part, this bitter sound that surprised me, because when exactly had Madison been there for me? When had she noticed me working myself to exhaustion, or acknowledged that her opportunities had come at the direct expense of mine, or shown even a moment of gratitude or remorse for consuming my entire college fund? My mother said, "I don't know what's funny about your sister's suffering, Emma. Honestly, your attitude about this whole thing has been really hurtful. It's like you resent Madison for taking risks and following her dreams, while you've always been so focused on conventional success. And now that you have the means to help, you're choosing to be selfish about it." And I ended the call shortly after with some excuse about having plans, and sat in my apartment with this growing clarity that nothing would ever be enough, that no amount of achievement or success would ever make my family see me as anything other than a supporting character in Madison's story, that they would always find ways to make my accomplishments about what I could do for her rather than celebrations in their own right. I started at Richardson and Cole in September as a first-year associate in the bankruptcy division, and the work was exactly as demanding as everyone had warned, with 60 to 70-hour weeks being standard, and the expectation that you were always available and always producing immaculate work product. But I found myself thriving in ways I hadn't entirely expected because the intellectual challenge was engaging, and Catherine Liu continued to mentor me, and I was finally getting paid enough to start making serious progress on the debt that had hung over me like a shadow for years. I set up an aggressive repayment plan that allocated nearly 40% of my take-home salary to my student loans, living in a modest one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that wasn't trendy but was safe and walkable, and watching the principal balance decrease each month felt more satisfying than any luxury purchase could have been, because each payment was reclaiming a piece of myself that had been stolen when I was 18 years old. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had chosen to specialize in bankruptcy law, spending my days analyzing corporate financial structures and advising clients on insolvency issues and restructuring plans, learning to identify the patterns of mismanagement and over-leveraging and poor decision-making that led to financial collapse. And I couldn't help but see my own family reflected in every case where someone had operated on wishful thinking instead of reality, had thrown good money after bad investments, had enabled destructive financial behaviors because acknowledging the truth was too uncomfortable. I made friends at the firm slowly, other associates who understood the pressure and the exhaustion, and I started dating someone I met through a friend's dinner party, a software engineer, named Marcus, who had also put himself through school and who understood what it meant to build something from nothing. And gradually, I constructed a life in Chicago that felt entirely mine in a way nothing ever had before, built on my own choices and my own work with people who saw me clearly and valued me for who I actually was rather than what I could provide. I went home for Christmas that first year because my mother called repeatedly and made it clear that not showing up would be treated as a hostile act, and I sat through an uncomfortable dinner where Madison talked about her newest idea for a business venture, something involving social media consulting despite having no experience or credentials, and my mother encouraged her enthusiastically, while my father nodded along. And when I mentioned that I'd been assigned to a major retail bankruptcy case that was getting national media attention, my mother said, "That's nice, dear," and immediately turned back to Madison to ask more questions about her plans, and I realized that I'd driven 4 hours each way to be invisible in my own family, to watch the same dynamic play out that had defined my entire childhood, where Madison's fantasies were treated as legitimate, while my actual achievements were background noise. I left the next morning instead of staying through the weekend as planned, claiming an urgent work matter, and drove back to Chicago with this crystallizing awareness that these visits weren't neutral, they were actively harmful. They required me to compress myself into a role I'd outgrown and to witness my parents continuing to enable Madison's refusal to face reality. And the cost of maintaining even minimal family connection was higher than I'd fully acknowledged. I stopped answering every phone call after that, let some go to voicemail, and responded with text messages when I had the energy, and reduced my visits home to major holidays only. And my mother complained that I was becoming distant and suggested that my success was making me think I was too good for family. But I knew the truth was simpler and sadder. I was protecting the life I'd built from people who had never protected me. And that wasn't cruelty, it was survival. 3 years after starting at Richardson and Cole, I made senior associate, which came with a significant salary increase to $240,000 base plus bonus potential, and the clear message that I was on partnership track if I continued performing at my current level, and by that point, my student loan balance had dropped below $40,000, a number that felt almost manageable compared to the mountain of debt I'd started with, and I was finally able to breathe financially in ways I'd never experienced as an adult. Madison, meanwhile, had cycled through what I could only describe as a greatest hits collection of terrible financial decisions. Starting with an MLM scheme, selling skincare products that required her to purchase thousands of dollars of inventory that ended up sitting in my parents' garage, followed by a brief stint as a virtual assistant that lasted 3 weeks before she quit claiming the client was too demanding. Then another attempt at starting a business. This time a lifestyle blog that was going to be monetized through sponsorships and affiliate links, despite her having no audience or content strategy. And most recently, she'd gotten involved with some kind of cryptocurrency investment opportunity that she swore was going to make everyone rich, and that required a $15,000 initial investment that my parents provided by withdrawing it from my father's 401k. I heard about each new venture through my mother's phone calls, which had become less frequent as I'd maintained my boundaries, but which still happened every few weeks. And each call followed the same basic pattern: updates about Madison's latest opportunity, delivered with manufactured enthusiasm, complaints about how stressed my mother was about money, pointed comments about my salary and how comfortable I must be, and then eventually the ask, sometimes subtle and sometimes direct, about whether I might want to invest in Madison's future or help out with some immediate financial need. I said no every single time, had become practiced at it, could deliver the refusal calmly and without extensive justification, because I'd learned through therapy that no was a complete sentence, and I didn't owe anyone access to my financial resources. But each refusal was met with some version of the same guilt trip about how family was supposed to support each other, and how I'd become cold and distant since moving to Chicago, and how Madison was really struggling with her confidence and could use her sister's belief in her. The fact that my parents had drained approximately $70,000 from their retirement accounts over the past several years to fund Madison's various failures was something my mother mentioned with increasing frequency, not as an acknowledgement that this had been a mistake, but as evidence of their sacrifice and devotion, and I could hear the unspoken accusation in every conversation. They had given everything to Madison, so why wouldn't I do the same? I watched this slow-motion financial disaster from a distance of 200 miles, and there was a part of me that felt vindicated seeing Madison fail over and over while I succeeded, proof that the difference between us wasn't talent or worthiness, but willingness to face reality and do difficult work. And there was another part of me that just felt sad and tired, watching my parents destroy their financial security for someone who had never once demonstrated the capacity to manage money responsibly or sustain effort when things got difficult. The call came on a Thursday evening in March when I was reviewing documents for a client presentation. My mother's name appearing on my phone screen with that familiar mix of dread and obligation, and when I answered, her voice had a frantic quality that immediately put me on alert as she said, "Emma, we need to have a family meeting this weekend. It's urgent." And I felt my stomach tighten, because nothing good had ever come from family meetings in my experience. I asked what it was about, and there was a pause before she said, "It's about Madison's situation. It's gotten very serious, and we need to discuss it as a family." And I knew before she said anything else that this was going to be a request for money. Could sense it in the careful way she was framing the conversation. And when I pressed for details, she finally admitted that Madison had accumulated $60,000 in credit card debt across multiple cards, and the minimum payments had become unmanageable. And my parents had co-signed on 2 of the cards, which meant they were legally responsible for approximately $35,000 of it. I felt this wave of exhausted anger wash over me, because of course this had happened. Of course Madison had been given access to credit she couldn't manage, and of course my parents had enabled it by co-signing, and I asked how someone racks up $60,000 in credit card debt without income. And my mother got defensive, saying that Madison had expenses and had been trying to get various projects off the ground, and sometimes you have to spend money to make money. All the same magical thinking that had characterized every financial disaster in Madison's adult life. My mother said the family meeting was to discuss how we were going to handle this together, and I heard the expectation clearly in that word, together. The assumption that I would contribute money to solve a problem that had been created entirely by other people's choices. And I said very clearly, I'm not coming to a family meeting, and I'm not giving Madison money to pay off credit cards she never should have been approved for in the first place. The silence on the other end of the phone was heavy with shock, because I think my mother had genuinely believed I would go along with this, that my refusals to invest in Madison's businesses had been different somehow from refusing to help with debt. And when she found her voice, she said, "Emma, this is serious. Your sister could be sued. We could be sued. We're talking about our credit being destroyed and possible legal action." And I said, "Then Madison needs to deal with the consequences of her spending, and you need to deal with the consequences of co-signing." And my mother's voice shifted from pleading to angry as she said, "You make so much money, this wouldn't even hurt you. Why are you being so selfish?" I had heard versions of this accusation so many times that it had lost its power to wound me the way it once had. And I said, where was my help when I needed it? Where was the family support when I was working 3 jobs to get through community college? When I was taking out loans because my college fund went to Madison's business? And my mother said, "We've been over this. That was different. Madison had an opportunity, and you were always so capable. You didn't need the same kind of help." And I felt something shift in me then, some final thread of hope that she might ever understand or acknowledge what had been done to me, and I said, "I'm not having a family meeting, and I'm not discussing this further," and ended the call. 6 months passed after that disastrous phone call about the credit card debt. 6 months during which I heard nothing from my family and experienced a kind of peaceful silence that I hadn't realized I'd been craving. And I threw myself into work with renewed focus, taking on additional clients and building my reputation in the Chicago bankruptcy law community. And then on a Tuesday morning in September, my mother called again, and this time her voice had a different quality, not frantic or angry, but exhausted and defeated. And she said, "Emma, your sister is filing for bankruptcy and we need you to represent her." And I felt every muscle in my body tense because this was it. The moment I had somehow known was coming from the second I'd specialized in bankruptcy law years earlier. Some part of me understanding even then that Madison's financial recklessness would eventually lead here. My mother explained that Madison had consulted with a bankruptcy attorney who quoted her $7,000 for a Chapter 7 filing, and said that my parents were also considering bankruptcy because they were $60,000 in debt between Madison's co-signed credit cards and their own expenses, and the monthly minimums were consuming my father's entire pension check. And they'd already drained both retirement accounts to nothing, and she said, "You handle bankruptcies, this is what you do, and Madison is your sister, of course you'll help her with this." With that same assumption of my compliance that had characterized every request throughout my adult life. I sat there in my office looking out at the Chicago skyline, at the life I'd built entirely through my own effort, while my family had invested everything in Madison's endless failures. And I felt this complicated knot of emotions that I couldn't immediately untangle. Anger that they had the audacity to ask after everything, vindication that I'd been right about Madison's financial incompetence all along, hurt that even now there was no acknowledgement of how they'd failed me. And underneath it all, a kind of professional discomfort, because I knew I couldn't represent Madison even if I wanted to, given our relationship and my personal involvement in the history. I told my mother I couldn't represent Madison, that it would be unethical given our family relationship and the conflict of interest, and she said, "What conflict of interest? You're her sister, that's not a conflict, that's family." And I realized she genuinely didn't understand that my personal feelings about Madison's financial irresponsibility and my parents' enabling would compromise my ability to provide competent representation. Or maybe she understood and simply didn't care, because in her mind, my role was to fix Madison's problems, regardless of professional ethics or personal cost. I told her I would send her names of several competent bankruptcy attorneys in their area who could handle the case, and my mother's voice turned cold as she said, "After everything we've done for you, you won't even do this one thing." And I felt that familiar twist of guilt before my anger burned it away, and I said, "Everything you've done for me? You gave my college fund to Madison. You've given her every advantage while I worked 3 jobs and took out loans. And now you want me to work for free to clean up another mess she created?" And my mother said, "We're talking about bankruptcy, Emma. We're talking about your sister's financial future and our credit being destroyed, and you make so much money that you could do this without even thinking about it." And I understood then with perfect clarity that she would never see me as anything other than a resource to be extracted from, a successful child whose purpose was to subsidize the failed one. I told my mother I would email her a list of 3 qualified bankruptcy attorneys who could handle Madison's case competently and affordably, and there was a long silence before she said, "Hold on, your sister wants to talk to you." And I felt my jaw clench because I hadn't spoken directly to Madison in over a year, our communication limited to obligatory birthday texts. And then Madison's voice came on the line with that familiar tone of casual expectation as she said, "Hey, so I guess Mom told you about the bankruptcy situation." As if we were discussing something mundane like a dental appointment rather than the catastrophic financial failure that was the inevitable result of a decade of irresponsibility. I said yes. I was aware of the situation, keeping my voice professionally neutral. And Madison said, "So obviously I need a bankruptcy lawyer and you're a bankruptcy lawyer. And I know we haven't been super close lately, but this is important. And I really need you to help me with this." And I noticed there was no apology in her words, no acknowledgement of the college fund or the pattern of taking while I received nothing. Just the same assumption that had characterized every interaction we'd ever had, that my resources existed to serve her needs. I told her what I'd told our mother, that I couldn't represent her due to conflict of interest, and that I would provide referrals to competent attorneys. And Madison's voice took on an edge as she said, "Conflict of interest? Emma, I'm your sister. What conflict could there possibly be?" And I almost laughed at the genuine confusion in her tone, because apparently the $75,000 of my college fund that had disappeared into her failed business didn't register as a conflict. The years of watching her squander money while I worked myself to exhaustion didn't create any complicated feelings that might compromise my professional judgment. Madison continued, "I can't afford to pay some random lawyer $7,000. That's why I need you to do this. You can just file the paperwork and it won't cost you anything." And I realized she actually believed I should work for free to clean up her financial disaster, that my law degree and professional expertise had no value when applied to her problems. And I said very clearly, "Madison, I'm not representing you, I'm not doing your bankruptcy for free, and I'm referring you to other attorneys who can help you." And her voice shifted from expectant to angry as she said, "Are you serious right now? After everything our parents did for you, after they raised you and supported you, you won't even do this one thing for your own sister?" I felt that familiar knot of rage and hurt tighten in my chest because apparently in Madison's mind, everything our parents did for me canceled out the college fund theft and the decade of favoritism. And I said, "Madison, they gave you my college fund, they've given you every advantage while I worked 3 jobs and took out massive loans. So no, I don't owe you free legal work." And she said, "Oh my God, you're still hung up on that? That was 10 years ago, Emma. I needed that money for my business, and you got through college fine. You have a great job now, so obviously it all worked out." And the casual dismissal of what that theft had cost me, the years of exhaustion and debt and sacrifice, made something crystallize in my mind with perfect clarity. I said, "I'm not hung up on it. I'm simply not going to enable more financial irresponsibility. You need to face the consequences of your choices, and I need to maintain professional boundaries." And Madison's voice went shrill as she said, "You owe me this, Emma. I'm your sister and family helps family. Or is your fancy lawyer job too important for you to remember where you came from? And I felt exhausted by the manipulation, by the attempts to guilt me into lighting myself on fire to keep her warm. And I said, I've given you the names of attorneys who can help. This conversation is over. And then my mother's voice came back on the line, no longer defeated but vibrating with fury. And she said, I cannot believe how cruel you're being. Your sister is facing bankruptcy, and you're worried about conflicts of interest and professional boundaries. What happened to you that made you so cold? I told her nothing happened to me except that I learned to value myself since my family never would. And she said, if you don't help Madison with this, then don't bother coming to any more family events. Don't bother calling. You're choosing to abandon your family when we need you most. And I said, I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm declining to enable the same patterns that have characterized Madison's entire adult life. And if that means I'm not welcome at family events, then I guess that's your choice to make. And ended the call with my hands shaking and my heart pounding, and something that felt almost like relief flooding through me because I had finally, clearly, without equivocation, set a boundary that I knew I wouldn't cross. My father called 4 hours after I'd hung up on my mother, and I stared at his name on my phone screen for 3 rings before answering because my father rarely called me separately. He was always a silent presence in the background of my mother's conversations, nodding agreement or saying nothing while she spoke for both of them. And when I answered, his voice was quiet and tired in a way I'd never heard before as he said, Emma, can we talk for a minute? Just you and me? I said yes, and felt my throat tighten because some part of me had been waiting my entire life for my father to see me clearly, to acknowledge what had happened, to choose me even once. And he said, Your mother is very upset. She's been crying since you hung up, and Madison is devastated. And I know you're angry, but I need you to understand how serious this situation is. And already I could feel the hope deflating, because this wasn't going to be different. He was just delivering the same message with a softer voice. He told me that they were $63,000 in debt, that they'd taken out a second mortgage on the house 2 years ago to help Madison with another business venture that had failed, that their monthly expenses exceeded his pension by $1,800, and they'd been using credit cards to cover the gap. And he said, We're going to lose the house, Emma. We're probably going to have to file bankruptcy ourselves. And I know we haven't always been fair to you, but we're your parents and we need help. I felt something crack inside my chest, because there it was, the closest he would come to admitting they'd failed me. Haven't always been fair. As if fairness was a minor inconsistency rather than a fundamental betrayal that had shaped my entire life. And I said, Dad, you gave my college fund to Madison. You watched me work 3 jobs and take out massive loans while she spent money on nothing. And you never once stood up for me or questioned whether what you were doing was right. And he was quiet for a long moment before he said, I know, and I've regretted it. Your mother was so convinced that Madison needed the support, and I went along with it because it was easier than fighting. And I was wrong. The words I'd waited years to hear, I was wrong. And they felt simultaneously validating and completely hollow because they came attached to another request for me to sacrifice myself. And I said, if you know you were wrong, if you regret it, then why are you calling to ask me to help Madison again? And he said, because she's still your sister, and we're still your parents, and yes, we made mistakes, but that doesn't mean you should abandon us when we're facing financial ruin. You're the only one who has the ability to help, and sometimes family means helping even when it's hard. I told him I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was setting boundaries after a lifetime of being treated as less important than Madison. And he said, Your mother will never apologize. You need to know that. She'll never admit she was wrong about how she treated you. But I'm asking you anyway to please reconsider, to represent Madison, or at least help us financially, because I don't know what else to do. And I heard the defeat in his voice, and felt my own pain rise up to meet it, because this was my father admitting he'd failed me, and in the same breath, asking me to accept that failure, and help anyway. To let my mother's inability to acknowledge her wrongs become my burden to carry, and I said, I can't, Dad. I can't enable this pattern anymore. You need to face the consequences of the choices you've made, just like I had to face the consequences of losing my college fund." And he said, "So that's it? You're just going to let us lose everything?" And I said, "You already let me lose everything when I was 18. You made a choice about whose future mattered more, and now I'm making a choice about my own well-being." And after another long silence, he said, "I guess I understand. I'm disappointed, but I understand." And hung up, leaving me sitting in my quiet apartment with tears running down my face, because even his understanding felt like a manipulation. Like disappointment was the price I'd pay for protecting myself. I sat on my couch for a long time after my father hung up, watching the city lights through my apartment window blur as tears kept coming. And I felt hollowed out in a way I hadn't experienced since I was 18 years old, sitting in that financial aid office, accepting that my future would be defined by debt because my parents had chosen Madison's fantasy over my reality. I had therapy scheduled for the next morning, a standing Tuesday appointment I'd maintained for the past 4 years, because law school had taught me that high achievement and unprocessed trauma made terrible roommates. And when I walked into Dr. Chen's office at 9 the next morning, she took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" And I told her everything, the phone calls, and Madison's entitlement, and my father's half apology that came wrapped in another request for self-sacrifice. And she listened without interrupting until I finished and said, "So how are you feeling about your decision?" I said I felt guilty and relieved and angry and sad all at once. That some part of me still believed I should help because they were my family and they were facing financial ruin, but a stronger part of me knew that helping would just perpetuate the same dynamic that had damaged me for years. And Dr. Chen nodded and said, "Let me ask you something. If a client came to you with this situation, if someone told you their family had stolen $75,000 from them and then demanded free legal services a decade later, what would you tell them?" And I laughed a little because when she put it that way, the answer was obvious. I would tell them to maintain their boundaries and not feel guilty about protecting themselves. And she said, "Why is it different when it's you?" And I said, "Because they're my parents, and some part of me still wants them to see me, to value me, to acknowledge that they were wrong." And she said, "Do you think helping Madison with her bankruptcy would make them see you differently?" And I knew it wouldn't. I knew my mother would take my help as confirmation that she'd been right to demand it, and my father would feel relieved that the crisis was averted without having to truly confront what they'd done. And I said, "No, it would just teach them that if they pressure me enough, I'll eventually cave." And Dr. Chen said, "Then you've answered your own question." That evening, I met my best friend Rachel for dinner. Rachel, who I'd met during my first year at the firm, and who had become the sister I'd wished Madison could be. Someone who celebrated my successes and supported me through difficulties without keeping score or expecting me to subsidize her choices. And I told her about the phone calls, and she said, "Please tell me you didn't agree to help them," with such fierce protectiveness in her voice that I felt some of the guilt loosen its grip. And I said no. I'd refused, but I felt terrible about it. And Rachel said, "Emma, you worked 3 jobs to get through college because they stole your education fund. You have $120,000 in student loans because of their choices, and now they want you to work for free to fix another mess they created. How is that okay?" When I got home that night, I opened my laptop and began writing a letter I knew I'd never send, pouring out everything I'd never said directly. How it felt to be 18 and watch my future dissolve because Madison's pipe dream mattered more than my actual achievement. How it felt to work overnight shifts and attend morning classes while Madison slept in and posted Instagram photos of her lifestyle coaching office. How it felt to have every accomplishment met with lukewarm acknowledgement while Madison's failures were treated as noble attempts that deserved endless support. And as I wrote, I felt something shift inside me. A recognition that my worth had never been determined by my family's inability to see it, that I had spent 10 years proving something to people who were never going to value the proof, and that the only validation I needed was my own knowledge that I had built a life through sheer determination, and I owed nothing to people who had taken everything and still wanted more. I found out about Madison's social media post 3 days after my father's call, when my phone started lighting up with notifications from cousins and extended family members I hadn't heard from in years. And when I opened Facebook, I saw that Madison had written a long post about how her sister, the successful lawyer, had refused to help her in her time of greatest need, how family was supposed to support each other, but I had turned my back on her when she was facing bankruptcy and financial ruin, and how she couldn't believe that someone who had so much could be so cruel to someone who had so little, and the post had 63 comments and had been shared 17 times, and I felt my face flush hot with anger and humiliation because she was telling a version of the story that made her the victim and me, the villain, without mentioning that she was bankrupt because she'd spent my college fund on a fake business and had refused to take accountability for a single financial decision in her entire life. My phone rang within 10 minutes, and it was my Aunt Sarah, my father's younger sister who I'd always liked but rarely saw. And she said, "Emma, I just saw Madison's post, and I want you to know that I think what she wrote is absolutely wrong. I've watched your parents treat you as an afterthought for your entire life, while they poured everything into Madison, and you don't owe her a damn thing." And I felt tears spring to my eyes because this was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged what I'd experienced, had validated that the differential treatment wasn't just in my head. And Aunt Sarah said, "I should have spoken up years ago when your mother gave Madison your college money. I was furious, but I told myself it wasn't my business, and I've regretted that silence ever since." Two more relatives called that afternoon. My cousin Derek, who was a year older than me, and said he'd always admired how hard I worked and thought Madison's post was manipulative bullshit. And my uncle on my mother's side, who awkwardly said he didn't know all the details, but felt like there were two sides to every story, which felt less like support and more like Switzerland declaring neutrality. But by evening I realized that Madison's decision to make this public had given me something I'd never had before, which was an opportunity to tell my side of the story to people who had only ever heard my mother's version, where Madison was the dreamer who deserved endless chances, and I was the cold achiever who had forgotten where I came from. I sat down at my laptop and wrote a response post, my hands shaking slightly as I typed, and I kept my tone calm and factual as I explained that Madison was facing bankruptcy after spending $75,000 of my college fund on a business that generated no revenue, that I had worked 3 jobs and taken on $120,000 in student debt to get through school while she lived off family money, that I had been asked repeatedly over the years to financially support her failed ventures, and had been called selfish when I refused, and that I loved my sister, but I could not enable financial irresponsibility that had already cost my family nearly $100,000 and was now threatening my parents' home, and I wrote that setting boundaries was not cruelty, and that helping family did not mean sacrificing your own well-being to fix problems that others created through their own choices. I posted it and closed my laptop and felt my heart racing because I had just violated the unspoken family rule that our dysfunction was private. But within an hour, the comments started coming, and they were overwhelmingly supportive. Friends from law school and colleagues and people I'd known in college writing that they were sorry I'd gone through this, and that my boundaries were healthy, and that Madison's post had been manipulative. And 3 more relatives reached out privately, including my cousin Jennifer, who said, "I had no idea your parents did that to you. My mom always made it sound like you chose to go to a cheaper school, and I'm so sorry." And I realized that my mother had been rewriting history for years, telling extended family a version of events that erased her choices and my sacrifices. Madison's post disappeared the next morning, and my mother called me screaming that I had humiliated the family by airing private matters in public, that I had made Madison look bad and turned relatives against them. And I said, "Madison made this public when she posted lies about me. I just told the truth." And my mother said I was vindictive and cruel, and she didn't know how I'd become such a cold person. And I hung up on her and blocked her number and felt something like relief wash over me. because the truth was finally visible to people beyond my small circle, and I was done protecting their reputation at the expense of my own reality. I found out that Madison had hired a bankruptcy attorney 3 weeks after our social media confrontation, when Aunt Sarah called to tell me she'd heard from my mother that the papers had been filed, and I felt a strange mixture of relief that the drama was finally moving forward and sadness that it had come to this, that my sister's financial recklessness had reached such a definitive endpoint. And over the following months, I heard updates through the family grapevine, even though I'd maintained my boundaries and hadn't spoken directly to my parents or Madison since blocking my mother's number. Aunt Sarah became my unofficial source of information, calling every few weeks to tell me what she'd heard, and she told me that Madison's bankruptcy had been filed as a Chapter 7, that she was liquidating everything including her car and the designer wardrobe she'd bought as business investments, and that my parents had been forced to take out a second mortgage on their house to cover the debts they'd co-signed, which meant they were now working into what should have been their retirement years because they'd spent their savings enabling Madison's failures. I felt sympathy for my father, who had at least acknowledged his mistakes, but I felt nothing but validated anger toward my mother, who, according to Aunt Sarah, was still telling everyone who would listen that I was cruel and heartless for refusing to help, that I'd abandoned my family in their time of need, and the fact that she could watch their house go into jeopardy and still not recognize the connection between Madison's choices and their consequences told me everything I needed to know about whether I'd made the right decision. What surprised me most was hearing from Aunt Sarah, 6 months into Madison's bankruptcy proceedings, that Madison had actually gotten a real job with a salary and benefits, working as an administrative assistant at a dental office. And Aunt Sarah said Madison had apparently been forced into it by the bankruptcy trustee who required her to show employment and income, and I felt a complicated mix of emotions, knowing that it had taken legal intervention and the complete collapse of her finances to make Madison accept the kind of regular employment that most people took for granted. At work, my career continued its upward trajectory, and my managing partner, Robert, called me into his office one Tuesday morning and told me that the partnership committee had been watching my progress and that if I continued on my current path, I'd be up for partner consideration within 2 years, which was faster than the typical timeline, and represented recognition of the reputation I'd built in bankruptcy law. And when I left his office, I sat at my desk and felt tears prick my eyes because this moment represented everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed for, and nobody in my family would fully understand what it meant because they'd never valued the journey that had brought me here. My student loan balance had dropped below $30,000, and I'd increased my monthly payments to $4,000, which meant I'd be completely debt-free within 8 months. And I spent time calculating what my life would look like without that monthly burden, how much I could save, what kind of financial security I could build. And I thought about how Madison's bankruptcy had eliminated her debts through legal intervention while I was eliminating mine through discipline and sacrifice, and there was a certain justice in that contrast, even though I knew my mother would never see it that way. Rachel took me out for dinner to celebrate the partnership track news, and she raised her glass and said, "To Emma, who built everything herself and never compromised her integrity." And I felt more seen in that moment by my chosen family than I'd ever felt by the family I'd been born into, and I realized that I'd stopped waiting for my mother's approval sometime during the past few months, that the validation I'd once craved from her had been replaced by self-knowledge and the recognition of people who actually valued what I'd accomplished. I walked into the Starbucks on State Street on a Saturday morning in early March, 6 months after I'd refused to represent Madison in her bankruptcy case, and I was standing in line scrolling through emails on my phone when I heard someone say, "Emma?" And I looked up to see Madison standing 3 feet away from me holding a green apron in her hands, and for a moment we just stared at each other in mutual shock, because this was the first time we'd been face to face since the phone call where she'd told me I owed her legal representation. and she looked different in ways that went beyond the obvious absence of designer clothes and professional blowout. Wearing jeans and a plain sweater that looked like it came from Target, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and there was something in her expression that wasn't the entitlement I'd grown accustomed to seeing, something that looked almost like embarrassment or shame. "Hi, Madison," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt because my heart was racing, and I was calculating whether I should just order my coffee and leave or whether this moment required some kind of conversation. And she said, "I work here. I just finished my shift," holding up the apron as if she needed to explain why she was in a coffee shop. And I nodded and said, "How are you?" because I couldn't think of anything else to say, and the banality of the question felt absurd given everything that had happened between us. She glanced around at the other customers in line and said, "Could we talk for a minute? Outside, maybe?" And I hesitated because I wasn't sure I wanted to have whatever conversation she was proposing. But I was also curious about what she would say now that months had passed and the acute crisis had resolved into whatever new reality she was living. So I stepped out of line and followed her out to the sidewalk, where the March wind was cold enough that I pulled my coat tighter, and she wrapped her arms around herself without a jacket. "I wanted to say that I'm sorry," she said, and the words came out quickly like she'd been practicing them. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, about the things you said in your Facebook post, and I didn't really understand what you went through when Mom and Dad gave me your college money. I didn't think about what that meant for you because I was so focused on my own opportunities, and I genuinely believed the business would work, and I'd be able to pay you back and it would all be fine. And I know that sounds stupid now, but I really thought I was going to be successful." I watched her face as she spoke, and I could see that this wasn't the full accountability I'd once hoped for. That there was still an element of self-justification in her explanation about believing the business would work, but there was also something I'd never heard from her before, which was acknowledgement that my experience had been different from hers, that I had actually struggled while she had floated on family money and delusion. "I'm working 3 jobs now," she continued. "This one in waitressing and some online transcription work. And I finally get what you were doing all those years, how hard it is to work like this and try to build something. And I'm sorry I called you selfish and said you owed me legal help. You didn't owe me anything, and I can see that now." I felt a complicated tangle of emotions listening to her. Part of me wanted to accept this apology and close the distance that had grown between us. But another part of me recognized that this wasn't full accountability, that she was apologizing for not understanding, rather than for the fundamental choices that had created the situation. And I knew that one conversation on a cold sidewalk didn't undo years of entitlement and the pain of watching my college fund disappear into her fantasy. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully, "and I'm glad you're working and building something real for yourself. But Madison, you need to understand that what happened wasn't just about the business failing. It was about years of Mom and Dad treating us differently, and you accepting that differential treatment as if you deserved it. And I can't just let that go because you've now had a few months of working hard." She nodded, and her eyes looked shiny like she might cry, and she said, "I know. And I'm not asking you to forget everything or pretend we're fine. I just wanted you to know that I see things differently now." And we stood there for another moment, in awkward silence before I said, "I need to go. I have work to do today." And she said, "Okay, maybe we could get coffee sometime." And I said, "Maybe." But we both knew I didn't mean it. And I walked back into the Starbucks and ordered my latte and left through the other door and sat in my car for 5 minutes, feeling emotionally exhausted, but also something like relief. Because I'd seen Madison humbled by reality, and I'd heard words I never thought I'd hear from her. And even though it wasn't everything I'd once wanted, and even though I had no intention of rebuilding our relationship to what it had been, there was something satisfying about knowing that the consequences she'd faced had created at least some capacity for reflection. And I drove home feeling less angry than I had in years, not forgiven and not reconciled, but somehow lighter. I logged into my student loan account on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 years and 2 months after I'd refused to represent Madison in her bankruptcy case, and I stared at the screen showing a balance of $0 and felt tears stream down my face, because this moment represented more than just financial freedom. It represented every sacrifice I'd made, every night I'd worked until 2 in the morning, every time I'd chosen loan payments over vacations or new furniture, or the kind of life my colleagues with family support took for granted. And I sat there in my apartment that I'd furnished slowly and deliberately with money I'd earned, and felt a sense of accomplishment that nobody could diminish or take away from me. The partnership offer had come through 6 weeks earlier, and I'd accepted it, and my name would go on the firm letterhead in January as Emma Christine Warren, partner, and I'd negotiated a compensation package that included a base salary of $340,000 plus bonus potential, and when I'd told Rachel, she'd insisted on throwing me a celebration dinner where my chosen family of friends and mentors had toasted my success and told stories about my dedication and brilliance. And not one person at that table had questioned whether I deserved what I'd achieved, or suggested I should be using my resources to rescue someone else from consequences of their own making. I had limited contact with my family now, structured and boundaried in ways that protected my peace, and I spoke to my father once a month in conversations that were cordial but surface level because he'd never been willing to stand up for me in ways that mattered. And I hadn't spoken to my mother in over a year, because she'd never apologized and continued to tell relatives that I'd abandoned my family. And I felt no guilt about this distance anymore, because I'd learned that family was something you built through mutual respect and care, rather than something you were obligated to maintain, regardless of how you were treated. Madison and I had no relationship beyond occasional updates through Aunt Sarah, who told me that Madison was still working her 3 jobs and had started taking online business classes, the kind of foundational education she should have gotten before spending $75,000 of my college fund on a fantasy. And I felt nothing much when I heard these updates. Not anger anymore, but not warmth either. Just a kind of neutral acknowledgement that she was living her own life and facing her own consequences, and that none of it was my responsibility to fix or manage or support. Last week, a young attorney named Jordan had been assigned to work with me on a case, and during our lunch meeting, she'd mentioned struggling with law school debt and family pressure to help support siblings who made less responsible choices. And I'd seen myself in her anxious expression and the way she apologized for sharing personal information. And I'd told her my story, the whole story from the college fund theft to the bankruptcy refusal. And I'd watched her face transform as she realized she wasn't alone in experiencing this dynamic, and she'd said, "How did you stop feeling guilty?" And I'd told her, "I realized that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty, it was self-preservation, and that the guilt I felt was manufactured by people who benefited from my inability to say no, and that my worth wasn't determined by how much I sacrificed for people who'd never sacrificed for me." I thought about that conversation now as I looked at my zero loan balance and realized that declining to help Madison had been the healthiest choice I'd ever made, not because I took pleasure in her struggles, but because saying no had been the moment I'd finally chosen myself. The moment I'd decided my own life and future mattered as much as anyone else's, and everything I'd built since then had been constructed on that foundation of self-worth and boundaries, and the recognition that love without respect wasn't really love at all, and I'd found peace not in my family's eventual acknowledgement of how they'd failed me, because that acknowledgement had never fully come, but in my own knowledge that I'd survived their failures and built something beautiful anyway, something that was entirely mine and that reflected who I actually was rather than who they'd tried to make me be. And as I sat there with tears drying on my face and my future stretching out before me full of possibility and freedom and choices that were mine alone to make, I felt grateful not for the journey that had brought me here, because parts of that journey had been unnecessarily painful and unjust, but for the strength I'd discovered in myself along the way, the realization that I could survive being unseen and undervalued by the people who were supposed to love me most, and still build a life worth living. And that was a gift nobody could ever take away.